now we're going to return to the program. We're going to focus on an appropriate topic to follow the Senator, the environmental consequences of energy supply and demand. And to lead us in this dialogue is Dr. Wes Reisser, AGS Counselor and Senior Foreign Affairs Officer at the State Department. Wes?
Thank you very much, John, and good afternoon. It would have been an even tougher act to follow the Senator in person, but it's a tough act even to follow Senator Whitehouse via video. As we looked in the last plenary session at the social costs and impacts of our energy choices and how that can change going forward, we now want to turn to look explicitly at the environmental cost. And there are indeed severe consequences, both on the supply and on the demand side of our energy budget. And this is a geography conference after all, and so our panel is going to try and take a look at some of these issues across various scales, from the global all the way down to the local. They each will be looking at a specific topic, but I hope to then return to a conversation afterwards where we can think about some of these key areas. And from the geographic perspective, there are a few key spaces that we can look at where the environmental consequences of our energy supply and demand are most gravely felt. That can be everything from land use change. In the past, we would have thought about that in the context of building coal mines, drilling oil wells, building refineries, et cetera. In the future, with fossil fuels, that may even be how to take these damaged lands and turn them into something useful again. As we heard from our colleague from the Navajo Nation, that is also in the space of nuclear. And then there are, of course, the costs to our air and our water, not just the climate. We've talked a lot about climate change over the last day and a half, and our first speaker is going to speak in some depth to that subject. But we should not forget that it is not just the air we breathe, but also the water we drink that is being poisoned by the energy choices that we make. And borders and states cannot control things that get out into the natural system, right? That we have used our atmosphere and our water system as a dumping ground for our energy consumption, and the costs on that are borne by people all over the world. I'm not going to go into any depth in the bios of our distinguished speakers because they're all in your program, but we will be starting with Dr. Diana Liverman from the University of Arizona, who's the Regents Professor of Geography and Development and also a Senior Research Fellow at Oxford University. She will be followed by Mr. Kevin Seegmiller, who's the Director of Program Management at Delta Environmental Sciences and currently pursuing his PhD. That will then be followed by Dr. Robin Leichenko at Rutgers University, who's a professor in the Department of Geography and co-director of the Rutgers Climate Institute. And we will conclude with Ms. Joanna Underwood, who is the founder and chair of Energy Vision and has been very active in this space for quite a long time. In 1974, she founded Inform, which was an organization that looked at analysis of environmental business practice, and now she's focused primarily in the space of sustainable transportation. So without further ado, we will have our first speaker, Dr. Diana Liverman.
Thank you. So, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to be talking about the recent IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on 1.5 degrees C. I'm going to summarize the results a bit, discuss some of the implications for energy policy and for sustainable development. And I'm a lead author for this report for Chapter 5 and also of the summary for policymakers that we had to get approved by all of the governments in Korea a few weeks ago. And having spent the last 2 days of that summit without any sleep trying to get the report finished, I've got sort of an IPCC hangover still. So the report was prepared in response to a specific request in the 2015 Paris Agreement The UNFCCC doesn't often ask the IPCC to do specific reports, but this time they did because the most vulnerable countries wanted to know if 1.5 degrees C was significantly less risky than 2 degrees C or higher. And they wanted to know what it would take to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C in terms of emission reductions, so that they could have the scientific evidence that would allow that discussion, political discussion, among countries about whether the goal should be 1.52 or something else. We were also asked to consider the relationship to poverty and to sustainable development and the sustainable development goals, and that was also quite unusual for that to be brought up to the highest level of an IPCC report. And the SDGs were approved after the or around the same time as the Paris Agreement, but after the last IPCC report. So this was the first IPCC effort to address the SDGs. So we had a very short 18-month timeline. Most IPCC reports take 3 to 4 years, and we only had 100 authors. Other reports have 500 or more. It was interesting because it was one of the only reports to work across all 3 working groups of science, impacts, and mitigation. We had 42,000 scientific and government review comments, and you have to respond to every single one of those. As I mentioned, the summary for policymakers approval process was absolutely grueling with round-the-clock negotiations. And there were a couple of countries, and it's actually public now, so I can mention that Saudi Arabia challenged every single word of the report and almost filibustered it right up to the end. Our own government was actually challenging, but not trying to undermine the science. One of the greatest challenges in doing the report was actually the lack of literature on 1.5 degrees C impacts. As you know, IPCC doesn't do original research. We assess the literature. And when we were asked to compare 1.5 and 2 degrees C, we went out there looking for the published literature. And unfortunately, our colleagues and we ourselves had not written very much on that. And that made writing the report very challenging. There was also not very much on 1.5 degrees C mitigation pathways, and I will say that we had to rely pretty heavily on just a couple of integrated assessment models with all of the associated assumptions. And there was also very little literature on the regional impacts of 1.5 versus 2 or higher, or on regional level mitigation. Nevertheless, we did our best. So what briefly did we conclude? Well, first of all, echoing and updating the 2014 IPCC Fifth Assessment, we assessed that we're now absolutely sure that the global average temperature has already increased by 1 degree C. So we're only half a degree away from 1.5. And one of the things that people forget when they focus on 1.5 is that's global. If you look over land or at different latitudes, warming has been much more than 1 degree C near the poles, over land, and at night. We also report very robust evidence that impacts are already being observed of global warming. For example, ecosystems are shifting, agricultural calendars are changing, and the chances of heat waves, droughts, fires, more intense storms and hurricanes are increasing. And we had a large literature that we could draw on there. And we suggested that at current rates of warming and greenhouse gas emission trends, we'll actually get to 1.5 C in 12 to 25 years. So we're almost there. A more detailed analysis of current trends and policies showed that we're a long way from limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C. Current policies across the world, if they continue and we don't implement, for example, the Paris commitments or more significant emission reductions, so current policies across the world would take us to 3 to 4 degrees C by 2100. The Paris Agreement that we were all happy about at the time is completely inadequate. That still takes us to more than 3 degrees C. So for those of you who think in Fahrenheit, this sort of 3 to 3.5 degrees C is more than 6 degrees Fahrenheit warmer globally. And in Tucson, where I live, could mean 9 degrees Fahrenheit. So I've done a few little calculations, and Tucson's current average July temperature is about 100 degrees, and it would go up to 109 degrees. So not only would we not become Phoenix, but we'd become Death Valley, which is not a place that most of us would want to live in July. So what did we find about the differences in impacts at 1.5 compared to 2? The bottom line is that every single bit of warming matters. The impacts at 2 degrees are significantly more serious than at 1.5. For example, the literature we reviewed suggests at 2 degrees, the tropical corals are gone, irreversibly. At 1.5 degrees, some of them survive. Habitat loss is 50% less at 1.5 degrees than 2 degrees. And the vulnerabilities are unequally distributed now at 1.5 and at 2, but the impacts on the most vulnerable are much less at 1.5 than 2. Just a couple of examples of that. The proportion of people exposed to water stress and heat waves double as you go from 1.5 to 2. Crop production is generally better at 1.5 than 2, although not at the poleward margins. Some countries actually do better at 2 because their agriculture is currently cold limited. Sea level rise seems small, 10 centimeters difference between 1.5 and 2, but that's a lot if you live near sea level, and an extra 10 million people could be affected. And the estimate of the number of poor and vulnerable people increases by 100 million from 1.5 to 2. The linkages between warming and the Sustainable Development Goals are complex, and we had limited literature, but we judged that warming could undermine many of the SDGs, including those seeking to eradicate poverty and hunger, to protect health and water, to reduce inequality, and to protect ecosystems, with more serious impacts on the SDGs at 2 than at 1.5. So what does this mean if we decide, based on these impacts and this assessment and these vulnerabilities, that we actually do want to limit warming to 1.5? Well, it's incredibly challenging. What we conclude is that it means drastic, in fact, heroic cuts in emissions, more than anything I've heard people talking about at this conference so far. It also means every effort to sequester emissions, either using natural sinks such as forests or technologies such as carbon capture and storage. To have any chance of keeping warming under 1.5 degrees C, we need to cut emissions by 45% between 2010 and 2030. And it would be a lot easier, since we're already a few years past that, to say we have to halve emissions by 2030. And we've got to get net neutral, net zero emissions by 2050, where any greenhouse gases would have to be compensated by sequestration or CCS. This means, we conclude, large shifts in energy investment from fossil fuels to renewables, nuclear, and bioenergy, and an overall increase in energy investment by about 25% in R&D in particular, in things such as storage, distribution, efficient appliances, and behavioral change. If we wait to act, we will risk serious temperature overshoot. Beyond 2 degrees, we assess, and we'll have to rely on as yet untested technologies at scale, such as CCS, and we do also talk about geoengineering in the form of solar radiation management, but conclude that that's not ready for prime time. And the one thing that all of the scenarios rely on is devoting a lot more land to biofuels and bioenergy. I have more detail if you're interested. The special report also assesses the feasibility of different mitigation options, including renewables, nuclear, demand reduction, dietary shifts, eating less meat, biofuels, and CCS. We identify the trade-offs and the synergies with sustainable development and the SDGs. There are many positive synergies between shifting out of coal to renewables and other mitigation policies with the SDGs. So reduced air pollution, which would be good for the health SDG. But we also looked at the trade-offs, and probably the most clear example is if this increase in biofuels encroaches on land needed for food, the SDG on hunger, number 2, or on biodiversity protection, which has 2 SDGs. We do suggest that if we could identify climate-resilient development paths, these are development pathways that achieve the SDGs whilst also reducing climate risks and emissions, that those could provide solutions if supported by appropriate and equitable investments. The report does provide estimates on the cost of mitigation, although based on rather limited evidence. And I also felt that in some ways we failed the most vulnerable nations because we were unable, based on the literature, to assess the costs and savings to adaptation if we were to limit temperatures. So that makes the negotiation over cost rather challenging when you get to the political arena if you've got costs for one and not the benefits for the other. So, in summary, the longer we wait, the greater the mitigation and adaptation challenge, we concluded. The more we rely on bioenergy and CCS, and the higher the risk of overshoot paths that take us above 1.5 and 2. This is probably the most explicit IPCC report. Usually IPCC has all these different scenarios and you can pick and choose which one you want. We had 4 pathways, and the one that kept us under 1.5, we were very explicit about the emission reductions that would be needed. The cartoon that you probably can't see very well in this room, but scientists often show it. It's a cartoon of a climate scientist providing warnings beginning with the first IPCC report in the early 1990s. 28 years later, almost my whole career, he wonders if the microphone is on or if anyone is listening. I would say that the last couple of cartoons here should actually be female. One of the things about the 1.5C report was it had 38% women authors, whereas the first IPCC report had 3. So on that note, I'll thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Kevin Seegmiller. Extremely happy to be here. First time in New York. It's taken me 40 years to get here. And walking to the hotel last night, I thought it would be my last time in New York. So very memorable experience, to say the least. I'm here today to share a tool that we use in Arizona to help reduce siting conflicts with renewable energy projects. A tool that's being used. We're very excited about it, find it to be very helpful as we look to our future energy world. The tool that I'm going to be sharing is called the Arizona Military Energy Land Use Plan, or AMUP for short, and it's a Department of Defense initiative that coordinates renewable energy development projects between energy developers, the military, and government institutions throughout the state of Arizona. In addition to sharing the tool, I'm going to talk about how each state in the country is eligible for federal funds to develop their own tool. Before I get into the tool, let's go to Arizona and warm up a little bit for some context. So, Arizona, we currently rank number 3 in the nation for installed capacity in solar energy resources. We've been titled the Persian Gulf of solar energy. If you want to build a solar energy project, Arizona is your place. If you've been to Arizona lately, the sun is still super bright. We have lots of open space there. And we know, at least nationally, there's a very strong demand for renewable energy resources. Arizona is still trying to figure out who it wants to be when it grows up, having some identity crisis with renewable energy resources in Arizona. Anyways, outstanding solar energy resources. In addition to our solar resources, we have a very strong military presence in Arizona. Each branch of the military makes its home in Arizona for many good reasons, for the sky, the 365 days of clear weather. In terms of economic impact, the military provides about $12 billion of economic impact to the state of Arizona. Very, very important player in the state of Arizona, and an industry that Arizona wants to protect. However, as we start thinking about building these large-scale utility renewable energy projects, the military has some concerns. They're concerned about radar interference from wind turbines, electromagnetic interference from transmission lines, the glint and glare, the high amount of reflection from these massive utility-scale projects, and the competition for water resources. In the graph, all the cross-hatching represents airspace that is managed by the military. The red's not showing up too much, but if you can see the red, that indicates areas that the military flies below 100 feet off of the ground. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. So as we look to our energy future, one of the questions comes up is how can we dramatically expand solar and wind without causing long-term significant impacts to the environment? If you're familiar with the Ivanpah project in California, it's a very large concentrated solar project that is currently experiencing environmental conflicts or green-on-green conflicts. Ivanpah is estimated to kill anywhere between 3,800 and 28,000 birds annually. That's a lot of feather pillows. It could be very dramatic. We don't know. They're also anticipating to spend $45 million to comply with federal and state mitigation obligations for the desert tortoise. So some fairly significant environmental regulations that they need to comply with. Habitat fragmentation is also a concern. The scarcity of water resources and competition with these scarce resources in the desert is also a concern. In fact, the BLM placed a moratorium on solar projects several years ago so they could have time to deal with these issues. And so as we understand this context, these natural conflicts that are occurring between solar energy resources, the military, and the environment, we've created an online interactive multi-user web tool to help address some of these issues. And I'm gonna do my own little lightning show here. So we'll see. We're gonna go ahead and press a video. So as you log on to the tool, you'll notice 6 data layer categories. Our first one is base maps, a series of base maps. Our second data category is that of renewable energy. So we've mapped out all the solar resources for PV, for concentrated solar power, the wind power classification. And these are statewide data sets, so they're fairly massive. And that of geothermal. Our third data category is some fairly standard reference data, jurisdictional boundaries, land jurisdiction, national monuments, wilderness area, tribal lands, solar authorized zones in the BLM, leasing constraints, a whole host of layers that would inform your permitting process and who you'd need to coordinate with. Our next really focuses on environmental concerns. We have a few data layers that look at sensitive habitats and threatened or endangered species. This tool is like any other tool. You can zoom in and out. You can click on a feature and an attribute box will pop up to give you some more information about what you're looking at. Our fifth data layer category looks at military. So we were able to map out all of the military training routes, the installation ranges, the special use airspace, noise contours around the military bases, and areas of operation for the National Guard. Our last, but definitely not least, data category is that of infrastructure. And I'll tell you, this required a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to obtain. We were able to map out the power plants, the transmission lines, the substations, the petroleum lines, approved utility corridors on the Bureau of Land Management, airports, railroads, a whole host of data layers. And we're gonna go ahead and put this on pause for 1 minute. So if you were an energy developer, you could come into the tool and you can click on each one of these layers and kind of do your own desktop analysis to inform your decisions about building perhaps a wind farm. However, we wanted to build some more sophisticated tools and reports into the tool that I'll show you how to do this, that really, I think, gets at the power and the benefit of this tool. So we're going to go ahead and resume the video. So the tool allows a user to create a project, and I've already done this for you. So we're going to, I know you like the Eagles, so we're going to do this, a Winslow Wind project, Winslow, Arizona. So if you needed to edit the project properties, you could do that. You go into the, you can change the title, you can change the project from a wind project to a PV or a CSP, a wind project or a transmission project. This is a wind project. You enter the height of the turbine, so we're saying 300 feet high, which we learned today are just getting higher. Power in megawatts, we'll just say 250 megawatts, and we'll say there's 100 turbines. I've already identified an area of interest with a bounding box. Once you've done this, you're able to generate a series of reports. Our first report is a contacts report. This report will give you contact information to every federal, state, or local entity that would be involved in the project. Tribes, utilities, NGOs. And I'll tell you, this was a massive undertaking, and it was the #1 issue that was identified during our stakeholder outreach process, was the lack of communication between the military, energy planners, and the government. So here's our contacts report, very massive just for this area. At the bottom of the report, we include a little snapshot of your area of interest. And then in the top right-hand corner, it allows you to download this report and take it with you to one of your 10,000 meetings that will be coming up in the near future. Our second report looks at encroachment on military areas of operation. And instead of painting these areas of operation a red or a yellow or a green to indicate difficulty, we really just focused on the likelihood of impact of that proposed facility on military operations. And so here, we're intersecting with a military training route. It's a service by the Air Force. They fly as low as 100 feet off the ground. And we say, based on the history of this use, there would be a high likelihood of conflict between your proposed project and existing or historic military operations. Before you start digging, please call Colonel Sanders, and we have his phone number right there. Our third report is a permitting report. This is really based on some of the backbone environmental regulations. So if you were to build on federal land, you'd need to comply with the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, NEPA, National Historic Preservation Act. We provided information about how to obtain a right-of-way on Forest Service land or BLM land or on tribal land, information about how to obtain a certificate from the Corporation Commission, so on and so forth. Our last tool that I'm not going to show here, or the last report, is an environmental report. This is really a report about the presence or absence of sensitive habitat or T&E species. So a similar report will pop up. It will indicate the species that is in that area, and then we have contact information to the appropriate agency. So that's a very quick review of the web tool. I'd like to talk to you a little bit right now about how each state in the country can apply for this grant. The funding entity for this grant is through the Office of Economic Adjustment. In order to be eligible, you need to be a state, a county, or a municipality of some sort. Even a tribe can apply for this. There are several partnering arrangements that you can work on this project. Again, the purpose is to support communities to help make better decisions about where we're going to put this infrastructure in the future, okay? The key is it needs to involve a military component to some sort. The military is a big player throughout the country. They understand these encroachment issues, and they would like to protect their areas of operation. And so if there's a planning component that involves the military, there's a very high likelihood that your state is eligible for this project. In terms of the steps, very, very easy. You submit a 2-page pre-proposal letter to the OEA. They give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down. If they give you a thumbs up, then you produce a 10-page detailed proposal that includes a project description, who are the players, how's the military going to be involved, and then some of the other basic components with budget and scheduling and milestones and whatnot. So that's a summary of the tool and the grant opportunity. Now, I realize that there is a tremendous knowledge base in this room about geography and renewable energy resources, and it's been a pleasure to share this tool with you. I want you to think about for 1 minute if any of these issues hit home to you in your state. If your state is experiencing issues with the environmental or the military and is trying to push the needle forward with more renewable energy, this project could be a perfect opportunity for your state to implement and build your own tool to address your own unique issues. If there's any questions about how to go through the grant process, if we can help in any way, please feel free to contact me or my colleague Lisa Brugg at ASU. We'd be happy to sit down with you, share lessons learned, arrange a partnership of some sort, and help each state in the country develop these tools to help our future energy. Thank you.
Hi, I'm starting out Robin Leichenko. I'm at Rutgers University, and my comments are going to focus on a topic that has, it's sort of been interspersed, I think, throughout the past 2 days. It's the issue of equity. It came up, a little bit yesterday when we were talking about energy poverty. It also sort of played a role in one of the bullet points that Diana brought up about equitable international approaches to addressing climate change. And what my comments are, what I'm trying to do with my comments is really get us to start thinking about how climate change and energy usage and how equity matters for these issues, and when we really think about 2050 and we think about the future, where I see equity as playing such a critical part is that we need to think about what kind of world we're creating. We know that we're going to need very significant, very dramatic transformations in order to maintain ourselves at 1.5, in order to sort of transition into different kinds of energy futures and so forth. But it really raises the question of what kind of a world are we going to have in terms of who's going to be making those decisions, how will those decisions play out, who will be affected by those decisions. So we really think about, just in terms of kind of some overview comments, we often think about climate change and energy as equity issues around mitigation or around the drivers of climate change. Who are the largest contributors, whether it's by country or whether it's by different types of population groups. We also think often quite a bit about questions of equity in vulnerability. Who's most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change? Diana mentioned that in her comments, that it was some of the most vulnerable nations that were pushing for this 1.5 report. We also are increasingly recognizing that there's equity questions around climate change adaptation, around adaptation to this sort of different future that we're having. Who's able to adapt, who's not able to adapt. And we've heard a lot of sort of macro scale analyses. We've had some micro scale discussions, but I think with the question of adaptation, it really spans from capacity of countries, different countries to adapt, down to the capacity of, even in this case, this photo's an illustration from the work we did in coastal New Jersey following Hurricane Sandy, around which households, even in a particular block, some households were able to take steps to, in this case, raise their house after Hurricane Sandy to be prepared for the next hurricane. Other households, very similarly sort of resourced, weren't necessarily able to do that. So even at the very micro level, we have sort of issues coming out around equity and around who's able to prepare, who's not able to prepare, and what can we do to enhance preparedness. What's also, though, I think, starting to emerge when we think about equity, we bring equity into the question, is equity around mitigation decision-making. And we heard even a little bit about who's going to lose their jobs, who's going to be gaining jobs in this sort of new economy. Inequalities around the adaptation responses that may create, build a flood wall. You may protect some areas, but create new vulnerabilities for other areas. So sort of inequalities, sort of kind of almost like spilling over and sort of reinforcing themselves. But then finally, and what I'm sort of going to shift into focusing on also is sort of the inequalities in who's able to participate in decision making. And this is, although this is starting to, I think, be much more of an issue within climate change adaptation literature, starting to really appear more in sort of energy justice literatures, I think it's important to remember that this has been certainly a major issue within the environmental justice community for a long time. So it certainly isn't a brand new thing. It really is just more a, as climate change and as the responses become more sophisticated as we move forward, we're bringing in more of a strong recognition of this type of what I call procedural equity and what others as well. Oops, wrong way. So let me just shift gears fairly briefly and just say a little bit about the work that I've been doing with the New York City panel on climate change. So, and as I'm talking about this part, I'm speaking for myself, not for New York City. If there's any city representatives in the room, just want to have a clarification on that. So the New York City panel on climate change has been around for about 10 years. It was modeled on the IPCC. It was sort of an NPCC for the city of New York to give New York City the latest scientific projections around how climate change would affect the region, and then sort of the latest sort of scientific sort of, state of the art on how can we prepare for climate change, how can we adapt, and up to sort of these are the 3 of the volumes that have come out so far. The focus has been much more around infrastructure adaptation, around sort of thinking about the city as sort of a macro unit, and then with energy systems, transportation systems, communication, and so forth. But what changed with this new iteration and with a different mayoral sort of regime was an explicit attention to equity. And so the work group that I was sort of co-leading with a law professor, Sheila Foster, who formerly at Fordham, now at Georgetown, we were tasked with looking at how can the city, in sort of building adaptation planning, how can they pay attention to communities, and how can they sort of incorporate consideration of equity? Now, so what was, so that's sort of, to me, like that's a really fun thing to think about and a fun question to sort of ponder. What was really interesting in sort of going forward with the project, and I'll talk just very briefly about some of the things that we did, was this realization of how different our understandings of equity are. So I think very much sort of from the city perspective, my perception of what the city perspective at least, was a real emphasis in terms of what's often termed distributional equity, so trying to identify, and they explicitly asked us, help us to identify the best methods for tracking social vulnerability, with the idea that we want to track and figure out where vulnerable areas are so that we can target resources toward those areas. And sort of, and I'll show in a moment a vulnerability map. But what we were, as researchers who have been working on environmental justice, working on climate change and equity, really were sort of bringing to the table was, wait a minute, there's a lot of other ways of thinking about equity. We need to think about contextual factors that are what we could term contextual equity, so social and political processes that are creating vulnerabilities or creating conditions where some people are more or less able to adapt, like as I was talking about earlier, as well as this idea of procedural equity. So who's in the room, who has a voice, who has capacity to sort of influence decision making. So so just sort of where then the project sort of played out, we ended up doing a set of sort of an analysis of this question of which vulnerability mappings, what method of vulnerability mapping should the city use, what kind of recommendations, and we sort of felt like this was kind of the distributive equity piece of the project, where we were mapping, so in this case, so there's one of the many maps of social vulnerability that we were putting together, but really trying to identify tools and appropriate methods. And we've seen obviously many, many maps today, but coming out of that, one of our sort of conclusions was almost any method of social vulnerability mapping is fine. They tend to use the same underlying sets of variables. They tend to use poverty, educational attainment, English as a second language, sort of a suite of very commonly used indicators, and so the outcome is the same areas are vulnerable no matter which indicator that you use, and so maybe potentially beyond, which is kind of sad for a geographer like myself who's been doing vulnerability mapping for decades at this point, to say, well, maybe even just single variables may be sort of a useful tool as well to really understand, pick out the single variables that you're interested in tracking those types of variables. But what we also sort of did in the project was then started to think about what about in particular places. So how do we understand equity from the perspective of the communities rather than from the lens of through the city, how the city is looking at equity and trying to bring equity into its adaptation plans. So in this part of the work, we partnered with environmental justice groups in 3 different areas of the city, northern Manhattan, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. And we're sort of building out case studies where we were trying to sort of really sort out what are the contextual equity factors that are creating conditions of vulnerability in these regions, what are the other pressures that these regions are facing, and what are how are these communities understanding equity, and what would they want to sort of bring to the table. And so this kind of back to my kind of earlier comments about sort of thinking about the future. This is sort of what, it's not just New York, it's every city. It's, we saw the map of Rhode Island. These questions of how do we plan for climate change are going to be on the docket for every place, and who's going to make those decisions? Who's going to be at the table when you're deciding, should we build a flood wall? Should we promote relocation? How is that going to happen? So I think this is, again, just, in some ways just as relevant as many of the other issues that we've been talking about as we think about the future. Just a couple shots of the communities. Some of the issues that they were sort of bringing out, they were very, concerned about climate change, concerned about flooding, concerned about heat in particular. Those were the 2 that really were coming out, and throughout this new iteration of the NPCC, those will be playing a strong role, but also the sort of legacy hazards. So the existing environmental justice hazards that are already present in these areas, the existing, sort of the processes of gentrification that they're already facing, and then sort of asking the question whether promoting climate change resiliency is actually going to potentially, create another round of what we call climate gentrification, and that's actually going to be the topic for my PhD student Kai Wynn's dissertation. Where are you, Kai? You're somewhere there, somewhere over there. She's not. There she is. So I should shout out to Kai for all the help that she gave us with this project. So then the other thing that we did in the project, though, was we tried to step back and say, well, we have a sense of what's happening inside New York, and from the perspective of New York, they're doing a pretty good job of bringing equity into the room and into the space. They're doing, they're making efforts to do community meetings in terms of procedural equity. They're making efforts to sort of have a good handle on the vulnerability mapping. But we really wanted to look across cities and to sort of see what kinds of adaptation practices and what kinds of adaptation sort of approaches are cities, at least cities in the Northeast, also putting into place. How are they addressing these issues? So we took a look at a number of different cities in the Northeast, and we saw something that was, the results are fine. The findings were generally consistent with what we are seeing with New York, where there was a very strong emphasis on distributional equity. And it wasn't just with climate change adaptation, it was distributional equity in terms of access to solar, access to energy efficiency, access to sort of efforts to sort of reduce air pollution. It was very much sort of this approach that equity means just making sure that places that are heavily impacted are able to adapt and respond. There was an awareness of procedural equity and a sort of bring the sort of this idea of we have meetings with communities when we're doing the planning. We've checked our procedural equity box. We're sort of doing a good job. But then sort of a sense from, and I didn't mention this for the New York case studies, but so New York primarily, but also I think equity in some of the other places, that the types of procedural equity that these groups want is a much more inclusive one, much more inclusive than simply have a meeting, sort of develop a plan, have a meeting, discuss the adaptation plan with the group, and then lo and behold, 2 years later, the people are seeing their, so this is the case of tree planting to sort of mitigate urban heat island. Suddenly trees are now being planted in the neighborhood, and the community sort of hadn't heard from the city in a year or two, and all of a sudden they're seeing trees being planted in places that the community doesn't necessarily want the trees to go. And so that sort of sense of wanting to be part of the adaptation conversation from the planning phase all the way to the implementation phase. And then again, I think that's sort of a current or a theme that I think is relevant for all sorts of efforts to promote transformation. And then finally, just some conclusions. So needing to recognize multiple dimensions of equity in terms of energy and climate change planning. So multiple definitions of equity, multiple understandings of equity, and not to sort of pick one and say, we're just going to do distributional equity, but to really have a slightly more holistic view And I think, you know, it's my thesis, and one of the theses of the book, this book that's coming out, is this idea that ensuring equity is going to be a critical piece for promoting sustainable transformation. And then, Jim, let me just credit the New York City panel, my co-lead Sheila and Kai, who's in bold, and the other panel members. Thank you.
I'm very pleased to be here, and it's been interesting hearing all of the discussions of long-term trends, of how you monitor what's happening, how you try to analyze the different factors of what's happening, and think about the fact, as our first speaker this afternoon said, the tremendous pressure we're on to make change now. Energy Vision has been very focused on looking at strategies. What particular strategies can we use that will actually meet the criteria for sustainability? Whatever they are, made from renewable resource, whatever they are, they don't have health-threatening pollutants, and whatever they are zero carbon. And in the field that we've been looking at, which is clean energy and clean transportation fuels, we've been looking at and comparing all the possible opportunities. We are not interested in Band-Aids such as biodiesel, which is just a Band-Aid on a yesterday technology. It's on really the systems that will work in the context of a sustainable future. And one of the concerns in our work is, which has been mentioned very often here, the question of time. How fast are we going to make these changes? Because we're a very smart species, and we've been able to develop lots of new technologies, but we're not moving very fast to take real advantage of them. And how much time do we have? So looking at Energy Vision's work, we came across a strategy that was very exciting to us in 2009, because it seemed to meet not only all the criteria for sustainability, but more than that. And let's see, our goal is not just to do the research of strategies, it is also when we find one we like and we think really works, and when you scratch the surface, it isn't full of obstacles, was one that we have been not just studying and writing about, but we are out there trying to make it happen. And that's what the work at Energy Vision is about. We were, 20 years ago, the first organization that looked at natural gas as perhaps the most promising alternative to petroleum for vehicle fuels. That was before the dialogue turned to fracking, which made us quite unhappy. And so we kept on looking. We thought natural gas would be a path to hydrogen. But no, we found there was something even maybe better right now that we could do, and that's what I'd like to focus on. And that is this emerging, what we think of as a new major resource for this world, for every country, and that is organic waste. All the food waste, all the waste from manures on dairies and farms, food processing wastes coming out of markets, the whole world of organic waste, which is a massive flow in this country and every other country. And we've got an estimate that it's about 1.9 billion tons worldwide. It's a big resource. And it does come from landfills, it comes from farms and dairies. About 800 million tons comes from manures and dairies. Just the sources that are listed here, including wastewater treatment plants. So there is all this resource material that is, we have found, wonderful for making not just one but two products. I'll stick to fuel first. A third of the food produced in this world is going as waste. That's a big waste. And so the question isn't, can we use it for something? It's how fast are we going to actually do this? The multiple uses for organic waste and the biogas, the methane gases that are emitted, everywhere organic waste is breaking down. You can trap this gas in tanks called anaerobic digesters. You can use it for any use you use conventional natural gas for. It's the same fuel, it's just that you make it without drilling, and it's good for heating, it's good for cooking. And what it's best for is fueling heavy-duty vehicles. It is the one absolutely real substitute now for diesel fuel, which is a quarter of all the fuel on roads, even though it's just the 10 million buses and trucks. They're using about 25% of our fuel. 3% of the vehicles on our roads are buses and trucks, heavy duty. They generate 24%. They're using 24% of all the road fuel. So that's rather big. You've got a sector of buses and trucks that move around in every city, in every town, and they're essential for services like refuse collection and recycling, and essential for moving people around. And those fleets we need to get more cars off the streets. There we are, okay. So that's what you can do with these biogases. By the way, for every ton of organic waste you have can be turned into 20 gallons of diesel fuel. So we can figure out how far the waste goes. Why is it so terrific to use this for a fuel now? One, it's made from a renewable resource, that fuel. Second, in the new engines that have been developed in the last 2 years by a company called Cummins Westport for heavy-duty buses and trucks, it's called the near zero engine, and it cuts nitrogen oxides and particulates, which are major health-threatening emissions, although there's a lot more toxic emissions from diesel exhaust. 90% below the EPA standards. It's very close to zero. And in California, they have said that using near zero engines with renewable natural gas fuel made from waste is as good an option as electric technology. The most interesting impact of this is it's the lowest carbon fuel available today. It cuts the carbon emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions, compared to diesel by 70 to 300%. 70 is if you're taking the gas out of the landfills. But how can you cut it by 300%? Well, if you use food waste and manures and you put them in these anaerobic digester tanks and you you capture the methane gases to refine, you capture much more methane gas in producing the fuel than is ever emitted as greenhouse gas, CO2, in burning it in a vehicle. You capture so much more of these greenhouse gases. It is therefore it is almost the only what we call net carbon negative fuel. And to meet the goals of the Paris Accord for cutting greenhouse gases, this resource, organic waste, is very important for two reasons. One, because you can produce a net carbon negative vehicle fuel, but the other is because if you leave all these organic wastes on the ground, they will all be simply leaking methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, and will never meet the Paris Accord guidelines if we don't do something about capturing organic waste, especially now that we can put them to good use. And it is not a strategy that is even on the list of Paris Accord strategies. It should be way up on the list. I like this chart on the climate case for renewable natural gas in vehicles. This was done by the California Air Resources Board. And what you see in these lovely, colorful bars is the amount of reduction compared to diesel in greenhouse gases you get. And you see way over on the right, you see a green bar that's plunging toward the bottom. That's renewable natural gas made from waste. And the amount to which it doesn't just cut down greenhouse gases, it takes them out of the environment. And that's thrilling. So how do you make this fuel? I'll be, I hope, very quick on this. You just capture the waste, put it in a tank. All this is technologically, commercially possible. You pull out the methane gases, you refine them, so they're basically CH4, and then you send them to refueling stations to refuel vehicles. And right now, one of the great battles is what is the quality of fuel you have to be able to have your renewable natural gas fuel go into a natural gas pipeline. That has kept things at a halt for about the last 6 years. The utilities couldn't come up with standards, although why the standards wouldn't simply be the same as the standards for frack drilled natural gas, we don't know. But we're actually meeting with 120 gas utilities and essentially last week saying, it's time for you to do this. This is one way that you can, quote unquote, decarbonize your natural gas stream, but it will also get this fuel all over the country. Here's a nice chart that simply shows that when you capture these organic wastes and process them, you don't just get one product, you get two. You get the gas from which you make fuel, and then the biosolids that are left. From that, you have high-quality compost. Nothing is lost, nothing is waste. And in developing countries where they have terrible problems with the aridity of their soils, they need compost and they need fuel. So this is something we're quite excited about. The industry is growing very fast. It's still mostly gas being taken out of landfills, but more and more it's the building of anaerobic digesters. There are 80 plants producing this fuel, and that's happened in the last 10 years. 41 of them were built in that first period. The other 40 have been built just in the last 3 or 4 years. And that is a very fast growth of a brand new industry. So there are, in 10 years since we started studying this and promoting it all over the country and doing workshops all over the country, there are 80 plants producing this fuel, and there are 20,000 refuse trucks and buses burning it, including at LA Metro, which is the second largest transit system in the country. The fuel use curve is steadily up with how much diesel we're displacing. And in fact, if you took all of the available organic waste, you could probably fuel 2 million of the 10 million buses and trucks in this country and 10 million else around the world. There are all kinds of different projects that have been exciting on this. I'll just flip very quickly. Toronto, we gave them an award at our annual Energy Awards event last month in New York. Toronto has managed to require that residents separate their organic food waste. We don't do that in this country because we don't think it's nice to make them have to do it. It's voluntary in this city, which is ridiculous. In Toronto, it's mandatory. They collect 93% of the food waste. Of course, Canadians aren't Americans. They're a little bit ahead of us in their willingness to actually make change happen. But they're taking all that and they are processing all that food waste in 2 big anaerobic digester tanks, and very shortly they will be fueling 90% of all the refuse trucks in Toronto. Nice, clean, and also very quiet refuse trucks. That's what's going on. It's a perfect model for New York City, just perfect. There are also other processing facilities in Fair Oaks Dairy. They have the biggest facility for taking the manures from the cows. Now we say that the cows produce two products. They produce milk, and they produce the fuel that's used to take the milk to market in a 3-state region. 42 long-haul tanks carry it, and they're all fueled by fuel made from the manure that the cows put out the other end. So this can be done all over the country now. Also, wastewater treatment plants. There's a lovely little one in Portland, Oregon. There's another wonderful one in Colorado. These are examples, but they are things that can be done now. And the payback, the economic payback on these projects is 2 to 10 years. We've just gotten to the point where companies are willing to invest in building the digesters, and also companies are willing to make natural gas trucks available if the facilities will be built and they can use them. Any community with 20,000 people or more can do this. That's why I was asking you about how many there were. It's all technologically possible. It's all doable today. And it's the only net carbon negative fuel that exists. And so anywhere you do it, you're having an enormous impact on climate change. What excites us is the fact that this is happening. And what has it taken to make it happen? It's really just taken someone, it happens to be Energy Vision, that is willing to go out and dog it and say, I've studied it, now I'm going to make it happen. And to take it to the places that can do it. We've done workshops in 13 parts of the country. And so I would posit that from all that everyone's learning here in this room at this fascinating conference, that if it comes down to making it happen, that's the only thing that's going to save us. And making it happen now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and thanks to all of our panelists. At this point, if we have any questions from the audience, if you could queue up at either of the two microphones. And I would ask, just for the sake of time, that any questions we have to please keep them brief and aimed at a single panelist if possible. Thanks. Go ahead, please.
Yes, hi, this is Bill Meehan from Esri, and I have a question for our renewable natural gas expert. A question I asked yesterday was about diesel locomotives that carry all our food across the country. Are we using, do you apply the same, can we use renewable natural gas for diesel locomotives?
You can. They have been, do I have to get up?
Nope.
You can. They've been testing it on locomotives, and it does work. It's a matter of how much production facility we have. But yes, anywhere you have diesel, you could be using renewable natural gas. You need a natural gas engine. But now that we have the most superb engine, it's opened up whole new fields of the large trucks that transport produce across the country that are much bigger than a refuse truck or a transit bus. Yes, it's moving in that direction, and it's been tested. If you want more information on where it's been tested, I'd be glad to get that for you.
Please.
My name is Tom Fitzwater. I work for the international component of the U.S. Census Bureau. I have a question for Professor Liverman. You had mentioned in one of your slides a difference of about 10 million people in the 1.5 degree scenario versus 2 degree scenario, displaced or impacted along coastlines. I'm curious if you can expand a little bit more on how those estimates were arrived at. Thank you.
Well, the estimates came from the published literature. So as I recall, it's the work of Bob Nichols, who's been working in this area for a very long time, numerous IPCC reports. But I would have to check, but in most cases where we had high confidence, we had at least 10 published articles going in the same direction. And I mean, I think this is a message I want to suggest, is that if you have something important to say, get it published in the next 2 years, because then it can be in the next IPCC report, because the most challenging thing was the lack of literature. And we knew there was data out there. In some cases, we knew people were working on research projects, but they didn't pay attention to the deadline to get it into the report. And for the most part, we went with the most conservative estimates. Almost every piece of data in there has uncertainty around it. So that's why you end up with 100 to 500 million in some of the estimates. But we were thin on published papers in many areas, but less so, I think, in the sea level rise area.
Thank you.
The IPCC really does scare us a little more than it used to, I will admit. However, I don't think they scare us enough. I see that there's a fixation about talking about sea level rise and temperature change. There was a recent NASA study published last month in the Earth and Planetary Sciences papers, which relates to the fact that the Earth is starting to pick up a distinct wobble at about a 4-inch displacement per year, which is not out of the norm. What is out of the norm is we're starting to see glacial upheaval. So where there used to be glacial foundations caused by ice pressure, the release of those ice pressures are starting to have the Earth rise, causing a less pressure on the tectonic plates that they support. On the flip side, Greenland loses a cubic mile of water a week, and 7,500 gigatons of water have just gone from a point displacement on the Earth to a distributed activity across all of the Earth, changing the pressure on the tectonic plates, causing changes in molten lava underneath the Earth. My bottom line is that if we don't get a handle of this and change the message to this is a little more extreme than people's coastline property, and it's starting to affect earthquakes, volcanic activity, and the actual sustainment of our planet, we're going to be in trouble. Any thoughts?
Well, we couldn't use the study that you just mentioned because it wasn't published in time. It's another example of important studies that we couldn't include in the report. If you go to the most people are focused on the summary for policymakers, which is only 25 pages. If you go to the main report, you'll find pages of discussion of not only sea level rise, but also the questions of tipping points. And the other challenge with sea level rise is that it's sort of a delayed but irreversible change. So some of the more serious changes, even though we're observing them a bit now, are actually 100 years out. They're things that we're leaving to future generations that could be irreversible. But it's hard to know how to please everybody, because there are a lot of people who accuse the IPCC of terrifying people and exaggerating the risk this time. And then there was another group of people who said, we haven't been scary enough. So you sort of end up in the middle. And the summary for policymakers has to be politically acceptable, which is the biggest challenge. And we had countries wanting to play down the risk, fossil fuel producers, and we had countries wanting to increase the risk, which were low-lying islands, for example. But thank you for your comment.
Please.
My name is Jessica. I'm a master's student at Hunter, and my question is for Professor Leichenko. You had mentioned community equity, and I'm wondering if you have recommendations about identifying communities and also how best to engage them.
So in terms of communities, the way that we approached the project was because we had sort of a limited amount of time, and we really didn't want to kind of reinvent the wheel. We actually focused on communities that had already had some track record of working on climate justice. Now, I'm not saying that's the only strategy, but I feel like approaching communities from, kind of getting a sense of which groups are already active in those communities was really critical for getting the groups engaged and getting the groups interested and sort of establishing trust so that you could have kind of more of a collaborative relationship around understanding vulnerability and adaptation and other issues as well, rather than sort of a scientist comes in and tells the community what to do. I think that model just isn't really working very well anymore. And so I think a more collaborative approach is definitely the way to go.
Great. Yes, please.
Xiao Shixing from Seaside Columbia University, Earth Institute. The question is for Diana. In the 1.5 special report has generated enough heat and recently, which is good or bad, but we operate US section of the IPCC data distribution center. And something is linking to public, to researchers, is actual data. You have been IPCC assessment leader for this long decades. So I don't know, it's getting better, but it still seems a problem. In all the IPCC reports, when they get published, and then we get questions for data. So what's your take? So, as a leader, you can put your influence on this to get improvements.
IPCC isn't creating data. We're just assessing the published literature, and every piece of literature we cite is publicly available, and should Season want to download the PDFs of all those articles and make them available, that would, of course, be fine, except for copyright, because many of the journals would not want you to do that, because we now have a very commercial publishing industry. The only data that was original for the IPCC 1.5 report were the scenario runs from the integrated assessment models, and they've already been made publicly available by EASA. So if you wanted to sign an MOU with EASA, people could get access to that. But it's very important to remember that IPCC depends on peer-reviewed publications of the community. It does not do original research. Just a quick shout out, if any of you are interested in influencing the next couple of special reports, the report on land use has just been opened up for review. So please review it rather than wait till it's out to criticize it. And there's a really fantastic report on oceans, which has been prepared. So both of those reports are forthcoming and are looking to the community to review them and tell them if they've missed really important articles. That's one of the really key things.
Thanks. Since I don't see anybody else at the mics, I'm going to take moderator's prerogative to ask one last question and shamelessly promote my book, which is in your package at the same time. And Kevin, you talked about some of the environmental impacts related to wind and solar. And you know, I know in a lot of the conversation, we always think about fossil fuels as being the primary drivers, and nuclear to a lesser extent, of the environmental damage that we see. But indeed, there is no free lunch, right? And so I was wondering if you could comment a little more in the Arizona context about some of the specific issues that wind and solar development will have on the ecosystem.
It's a very interesting comment or question. And I'll frame it this way. I had a recent conversation with the director of renewable energy for the Bureau of Land Management. And I asked him directly, like, what are some of the biggest issues you see? You see all these applications come in, what are the biggest issues? He says, there aren't really many issues that we can't overcome. Most of the permitting requirements for a renewable energy project is procedural. So as long as you go through the hoop, and you can endure the permitting process, there's a high likelihood that you'll get your project approved. The issue, he said, is that there's not a market for it right now. In Arizona, we have a fairly low portfolio standard. And there was a ballot initiative recently that was voted on, and it failed dramatically to push our portfolio standard up to 50%.
Because of very heavy investment by our utilities to try to stop it happening, right?
Absolutely, there's a lot of politics. So from an environmental standpoint, there's concerns. I don't think it's as much about the science, but kind of there's still cherished landscapes and ecosystems that we care about.
But if I could just add, I mean, the sort of mapping that you're doing is really very important, because a number of the private investors have gone in and they've found a site and they've been completely unaware of, say, desert tortoises. And that we actually know a lot about where they are. And if you just have the multi-layered maps to identify sites that will have the least conflict, then it's a lot easier to make it happen, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Yes, please, last word to Joanna.
I just wanted, when you were saying, what are the downsides? There are really no downsides to solar or wind anymore. They used to kill lots of birds with wind machines, but they don't now. There are no downsides to renewable natural gas. You're in fact solving a waste problem at the same time as you're creating two wonderful products. It's a matter of making it happen and of using the skills and the information that you have to put pressure on the system to make change go faster. In New York City, we had $60 billion in costs and 100 people dead in Superstorm Sandy. They still are not moving very fast to move to clean fuels, let alone renewable natural gas, and we have 2 million tons of food waste every year that we could be using to make our own fuel. It's really shocking. And is it because people have too much paper on their desk? Because they go home at night and they just don't want to worry about one more thing? But if everyone here, with the amount of knowledge that you have, were able to plant that in the ears of people and really promote it, nothing's more important, I think, now than saying, we don't have time to wait.
Well, thank you so much to Robin, Diana, Kevin, and Joanna. It's really been a pleasure. And please give one more hand to our panelists. Thank you.